Mhm. 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 Hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay. You'll be seeing me in just a second. I hope. I hope you're well tonight. I'm doing well myself. Of course, the news is very often bad, but there are also some very good things. But I try hard to keep on fighting, and I hope that you will too. The most important thing is to keep on fighting. So, let me go to Facebook now and see what you're doing. So, my daughter Devorah says, "Hi, Pop." Hi, honey. Lana says, "Greetings from Minneapolis." Thank you, Lana. It's always good to get greetings from Minneapolis. Laura says, "Hi, everybody." And Amber Lee Rodrigo says, "Hello from the Evergreen State." Land of a thousand wineries. Hmm. Well, you stumped me. I'm not sure what the evergreen state is. I know there are a lot of wineries in New York State. That, of course, is where I'm from. I'm actually from New York City, as a matter of fact. And there are a lot of evergreens in New York State, too. But anyway, I'm sure you'll tell me where you're from. And Dolores says hi. Bonnie says hi. And Russ says, sadly, I'm hanging out in the Bible Belt land of Georgia. Damn lonely here. Sorry to hear that, Russell. Okay. I think that Greg Mallard is in Georgia too, isn't he? And Russ says the Evergreen State, Washington State? Question mark. We're getting a geography lesson tonight. Where the Evergreen State is. Okay, so the topic for tonight is whistleblowers and democracy. So, how important are whistleblowers to democracy? Well, okay, I think we have to look at it from the point of view of how hard it is for people to come together so that democracy can work in true fashion from the bottom up. For people to come together, they have to have information that they can rely upon. They have to know what's happening. Otherwise, our attempts to change things will fail because we won't know basically what's happening. We won't have a good idea of the causes, okay, of what's happening, and we won't have a good idea, okay, of what to do about it. In our modern democracies today, we have a situation where there's been a concentration of the media, and the media institutions are incredibly more powerful, okay, than we are. In turn, they're controlled by very few of us, by oligarchs. The Washington Post is indirectly controlled by the richest person in the world at this point. And the New York Times is controlled by very rich people as well. All the major newspapers, all the mainstream channels, okay, of media are all controlled by very, very rich people. And increasingly, our government has been directly or indirectly controlled by rich people. There have been many studies about this, and the studies show that the influence of most people, in terms of what most people want, is largely ignored by our government and has been largely ignored by our government for a very long time now. What people want doesn't seem to matter. And when it does happen to matter, what they want is not always what they ought to want, interpreted as what they would want, if they had an accurate picture of the world around them. We know they don't, because we know the media is distorting their view. We know the manipulation that is going on because we see it all around us. We see it in the campaigns. And right now, there was a poll recently released in Florida. Was it by the University of South Florida or North Florida? I forget, but it was by one of the Florida universities. Okay, and they took a poll of what people thought of the top Democrats. The person who was running the poll, they decided that he was going to put in a good many of the candidates into the poll, but he was going to leave Bernie Sanders out. So he polled basically how Joe Biden was doing against Elizabeth Warren. When an employee of his asked him, "Why are we excluding Bernie Sanders? How can we exclude Bernie Sanders from this but from this poll? I mean, Bernie Sanders is standing so high in other polls now. How can we poll without having Sanders in the poll?" And her boss replied and said, "Well, don't worry, he won't be important for very long." So the person who was running that poll was putting his own private opinion into the methodology of polling in that instance. He thought he was under no obligation to put Bernie Sanders on the poll, okay, at all. I suppose he hoped that maybe people would forget that Bernie Sanders was running for president. We've also seen countless instances in this campaign where people in the mainstream media do things like, they provide a chart, and Joe Biden is up at the top of the chart, and Elizabeth Warren is second on the chart of those who were polled, and Bernie is third on the chart of those who were polled. But when you look at the numbers, it looks like Bernie is ranked second and Elizabeth Warren is third in the rankings. So how could they do that? How could they make such a mistake? Well, people kept on saying that, oh, it's just due to negligence or incompetence, okay, or honest mistakes. But when the honest mistakes are always made in relation to Bernie Sanders and to Tulsi Gabbard and to Andrew Yang, you sort of get the feeling that the media is manipulating information. When the media but does this, when it actually manipulates information, it often does it at the request of the executive branch, okay, the government. That is, the executive branch wants to give us a particular view of what's going on in a particular nation in the world. So the Pentagon press people call the press people in the media, the mainstream media, and they give them their view on what's going on in Venezuela. And we've seen the phenomenon again and again and again where the press, the mainstream media, acts as stenographers for the Defense Department or stenographers for the State Department. In other words, acting as propaganda media rather than acting as the news media they claim to be. We see this all the time. We see this every day. So we're being bombarded with views of the federal government and what is going on in the federal government that are being presented by people who don't want to describe what actually is going on in various sections of the world or inside of the government. They're giving us propaganda about what is going on, but they never tell the truth if the truth would put them in a bad light, even in a slightly bad light. They don't like to talk about their problems, which means they don't like to talk about our problems, which means they don't want to have the influence of democracy upon them. And so they condition the information that we get. And we live in that kind of information environment every day, where the large and powerful institutions in our society are manipulating the information we get about what is going on in the world. We all know this by now. We all see it all the time, every day. And that is one reason why whistleblowers are necessary for democracy. Now, Trump has been recently calling the whistleblower that revealed his attempts to get the president of the Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. He's been attempting to find out the name of the whistleblower, and the people in the intelligence community are trying to hide the whistleblower and protect the whistleblower in this case, because the whistleblower is ratting on the president and not ratting on them. I use ratting in quotes here, of course, in scare quotes. So Trump is trying to find out who the whistleblower is, and then he wants to reveal the name of the whistleblower so he can perhaps endanger his life, or perhaps he can prosecute him under the Espionage Act. And so the intelligence community is trying to hide his name. And Trump, in order to blacken the image of the whistleblower, is calling him a spy. A spy. Condemning him as a spy. Speaking contemptuously of him as a spy. Well, I have news for us, for everybody listening. Whistleblowers are spies. They are our spies. They are our spies who can set the record straight in relation to what is going on in the government that supposedly is our government and supposedly represents us and supposedly is legislating in our interest and supposedly is executing the laws in our interest. We all know that this rarely happens. They do all those things in their interest, not in our interest. And we need to know when this is happening and how it's happening and what methods they're using to have this happen. And how do we get the deepest of this information? How do we learn the deepest of secrets of how things are done behind closed doors and behind the scenes? The answer is we learn it through leaks. We learn it through whistleblowers. We also learn it through publishers and through press people who are not part of the mainstream media. Sometimes we even learn it from the mainstream media because they want to make money from what the whistleblowers have to reveal, as the New York Times did when it published stories broken by WikiLeaks and when it told the Snowden story, because it thought it could make a bundle off the Snowden story, which it proceeded to do. So sometimes even the mass media, which is dedicated to distorting the truth, can tell us what is happening. And so we need to have the whistleblowers, and we need to have institutions they can tell their story to. And they can tell their story to the superiors in the Defense Department or the state government, the State Department, or the government in general, because the people inside the institutions are dedicated to protecting the institutions. And they define that, they interpret that as it's their job to protect the institutions from us knowing the truth about how the institutions behave. They think that's their job. So for the most part, it's futile for the whistleblowers to go to the chain of command in the institutions. It has to be possible for the whistleblowers to go to the press, to go to people in the media who have an incentive to tell their story. Now, is their story always going to be true or right? No, it's not. Sometimes the motive of the whistleblowers will not be pure. Too bad. That's life. They're human beings. They're going to distort the same way everybody else is going to distort. But nevertheless, we have to make it possible to hear their stories. We have to give them the freedom to tell those stories, and we have to give them the freedom to be able to tell those stories without without penalties awaiting them. It cannot be illegal to provide a narrative to the press about law breaking within the government. That has to be legal. There have to be rewards for it, including monetary prizes. And there have to be for protections for people who attempt to sell such stories so that they can't be punished. Because we need them to tell those stories. How else are we going to find out about what people are doing in our institutions when they have all the information they can possibly have about us, but we have no information about them? That is an asymmetry of power caused by the asymmetry of information. Yes, Amber Lee, the public has to be able to judge. And for the public to be able to judge, it has to have the information in the first place. In a democracy, the public has to be able to judge. But we know that it's in the interest of the institutions to make it impossible for the people to accurately judge. Their interest is to hide things from us. So we have to have counterweights to that interest that they cannot control. And the whistleblowers are important counterweights. Now, in saying this, we have to recognize what has been going on with whistleblowers, at least since the turn of the century. Whistleblowers have been subjected to serious punishments. In the Obama administration, 8 whistleblowers were prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Some were jailed. Others were subjected to severe economic penalties in defending themselves against people who were trying to deter other whistleblowers. In other words, a lot of the reason why whistleblowers are subjected to serious punishments is to deter other people from becoming whistleblowers. So marriages are destroyed, finances are destroyed, careers are destroyed, people are jailed for a long time, people are subjected to torture. Chelsea Manning has been subjected to torture over a long period of time, torture which is still going on. Snowden has been subjected to exile because he was smart enough to go somewhere else where he at least could live with a modicum of freedom. And of course, Julian Assange is now being tortured because as a publisher, he told a story. So, with these very severe charges against whistleblowers in the Obama administration and in the Trump administration, in both administrations, 8 people have been subjected to prosecutions under the Espionage Act. 8 people each. Both presidents, in doing that, have severely undermined the checks and balances that exist in our democracy. We have to recognize that. By the way, there are many, many ways in which Obama was a terrible president. I know there are some of you who still don't think that, but you should think that. And this was one of the key ways in which he was one of our very, very poor presidents. But he undermined civil liberties in other ways too. The Occupy movement was not crushed in spite of the President of the United States. It was crushed in great part because he supported and behind the scenes arranged for the crushing of the Occupy movement, which postponed the mass movement we're going through now by at least a few years, and which violated, of course, the Constitution, the freedom of assembly that all Americans are guaranteed. So don't think I'm saying, oh, terrible, terrible Trump, terrible, terrible Trump, terrible, terrible Bush, and terrible, terrible Obama as well. Our presidents have been terrible for a long time, terrible domestically, leaving the economy in a shambles, and terrible in foreign policy also. I mean, look at the Middle East. The Middle East was always in a bad way. But in the last years, since the turn of the century, we've done more to break the Middle East than was ever done before. Than was ever done before. So, what's been happening to the whistleblowers? What's going on? Well, there are some good things and there are some bad things. Let's go over some posts. And there was a piece in Truthdig by Jake Johnson. It's called Assange Lawyers Issue Stark Warning to Journalists Around the World. And did I let you see it yet? No, I guess I didn't. So here I go. I guess this originally appeared at Common Dreams. I should have picked it up there, but I picked it up at Truthdig, so I often carry the same things. I'm going to get rid of the extraneous matter now, and you'll be able to see this better. I'll be able to see it better, too. Lawyers for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange on Monday warned of potentially devastating consequences for journalism around the world after a British judge denied Assange's request to delay his U.S. extradition hearing in February. Julian Assange struggled to say his own name and date of birth during the hearing. Okay, it's at Westminster Magistrates Court in London. I can't think properly, quote unquote. He told Judge Vanessa Barretza. Yes, that's how you pronounce it. The WikiLeaks publisher has been behind bars since he was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy by UK police. Supporters say that Assange's waning physical and mental condition is a consequence of his prolonged isolation, which the United Nations condemned as torture. So Assange has been in isolation even at the time he was in the embassy for a very long period of time. And then when he was taken into to custody, he was put into Belmarsh prison, and he's being kept there in solitary. And that's been the case now for what, 4 or 5 months or something like that. His legal team requested a 3-month delay to submit new evidence in the U.S. extradition case, including reports that a Spanish security firm spied on Assange on behalf of U.S. intelligence agencies. The allegation is the subject of an ongoing investigation by the Spanish National Court. If Assange is sent back to the U.S., he could face up to 175 years in prison on more than a dozen charges related to WikiLeaks' publication of classified documents that exposed American war crimes and other state secrets. Quote, I don't understand how this is equitable, unquote, said Assange on Monday. Quote, this superpower had 10 years to prepare for this case, and I can't access my own writings. It's very difficult where I am, he means in Belmarsh prison, to do anything. But these people have unlimited resources, unquote. So he's telling us he can't even properly defend himself because he doesn't have access to his own writings. How can he prepare a defense? Quote, they are saying journalists and whistleblowers are enemies of the people, unquote, he said of the Trump administration. Quote, they have unfair advantages dealing with documents. They know the interior of my life with my psychologist. They steal the DNA of my children. This is not equitable, what is happening here, unquote. It's so clear. This is a tweet from Glenn by Greenwald on October 21st, 2019. It's so clear people would be indignant about Trump administration's efforts to prosecute anyone else for espionage for publishing documents. But because Assange made enemies of both parties, yes, because he was an impartial disclosure of truths, few care that he's been just disappeared from the world and is being mentally tortured. Well, I care, and I hope you do too. Mark Summers, one of Assange's lawyers, called the U.S. extradition effort, quote, a political attempt to signal to journalists the consequences of publishing information, unquote. Quote again, it's legally unprecedented, Summers said. This is part of an avowed war on whistleblowers to include investigative journalists and publishers, unquote. So that's what Jake Johnson had to say in Common Dreams. Something that gets closer to the stark truth comes from Craig Murray, who is a former ambassador and a friend of Assange, and who attended the events in the Westminster Magistrates Court. And this is from his blog, Craig's blog. It's published on the 22nd of October 2019, just yesterday, and it's called Assange in Court, and I'll get that on for you so you can read it. And Craig Murray says, I was deeply shaken while witnessing yesterday's events in Westminster Magistrates Court. Every decision was railroaded through over the scarcely heard arguments and objections of Assange's legal team by a magistrate who barely pretended to be listening. Before I get on to the blatant lack of fair process, the first thing I must note was Julian's condition. I was deeply shocked by just how much weight my friend has lost, by the speed his hair has receded, and by the appearance of premature and vastly accelerated aging. He has a pronounced limp I have never seen before. Since his arrest, he has lost over 15 kilograms in weight. For those who don't know, that is roughly that should be the equivalent of 33 pounds if I did my multiplication in my head correctly. But his physical appearance, he was always, by the way, thin, but his physical appearance was not as shocking as his mental deterioration. When asked to give his name and date of birth, he struggled visibly over several seconds to recall both. I will come to the important content of his statement at the end of proceedings in due course, but his difficulty in making it was very evident. It was a real struggle for him to articulate the words and focus his train of thought. He obviously, this is my comment, he obviously wasn't in shape to have a hearing. He wasn't well, but they would not give him a delay. Until yesterday, said Craig Murray, I had always been quietly skeptical of those who claimed that Julian's treatment amounted to torture. But even of Niels, I guess it's Meltzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, and skeptical of those who suggested he may be subject to debilitating drug treatments, but having attended the trials in Uzbekistan of several victims of extreme torture, and having worked with survivors from Sierra Leone and elsewhere, I can tell you that yesterday changed my mind entirely, and Julian exhibited exactly the symptoms of a torture victim brought blinking into the light, particularly in terms of disorientation, confusion, and the real struggle to assert free will through the fog of learned helplessness. I had been even more skeptical of those who claimed, as a senior member of his legal team did to me on Sunday night, that they were worried that Julian might not live to the end of the extradition process. I now find myself not only believing it, but haunted by the thought. Everybody in that court yesterday saw that one of the greatest journalists and most important dissidents of our times is being tortured to death by the state before our eyes. Actually, by two states, by the United Kingdom and by the United States. To see my friend, the most articulate man, the fastest thinker I have ever known, reduced to that shambling and incoherent wreck was unbearable. Yet the agents of the states, particularly the callous magistrate, Vanessa Baretzer, were not just prepared but eager to be part of this blood sport. She actually told him that if he were incapable of following proceedings, then his lawyers could explain what had happened to him later. A big help, right? When you go to a hearing, that's a big help. Your lawyers can explain to you later. The question of why a man who, by the very charges against him, was acknowledged to be highly intelligent and competent, had been reduced by the state to somebody incapable of following court proceedings gave her not a millisecond of concern. The charge against Julian is very specific: conspiring with Chelsea Manning to publish the Iraq war logs, the Afghanistan war logs, and the State Department cables. These charges are nothing to do with Sweden, nothing to do with sex, and nothing to do with the 2016 U.S. election. A simple clarification: the mainstream media appears incapable of understanding. By the way, the mainstream media has been part of the lynch mob of Julian Assange as well for a very, very long time. The purpose of yesterday's hearing was case management in order to determine the timetable for the extradition proceedings. The key points at issue were that Julian's defense was requesting more time to prepare their evidence and arguing that uh, political offenses were specifically excluded from the extradition treaty. There should, they argued, therefore be a preliminary hearing to determine whether the extradition treaty applied at all. The reasons given by Assange's defense team for more time to prepare were both compelling and startling. They had very limited access to their client in jail and had not been permitted to hand him any documents about the case until 1 week ago. By the way, we don't know how much sleep he got in that week either, because we don't know if they let him sleep or kept the lights on all night long. He had also only just been given limited computer access, and all his relevant records and materials had been seized from the Ecuadorian embassy by the U.S. government. And that was allowed to happen only illegally because he'd been granted asylum. And the asylum was lifted by Lenin Moreno in a corrupt and illegal act. When you give someone asylum, as he had been given asylum, that someone is then a citizen, okay, of Ecuador. You cannot revoke that citizenship through actions of the president himself. That was not lawful. The U.S. government doesn't have those materials, doesn't lawfully have those materials of Assange. They seized them unlawfully. They still belong to Assange. Furthermore, the defense argued they were in touch with the Spanish courts about a very important and relevant legal case in Madrid, which would provide vital evidence. It showed that the CIA had been directly ordering spying on Julian in the embassy through a Spanish company, UC Global, contracted to provide security there. Crucially, this included spying on privileged conversations between Assange and his lawyers, discussing his defense against these extradition proceedings, which had been in train in the USA since 2010. In any normal process, that fact would in itself be sufficient to have the extradition proceedings dismissed. Incidentally, I learned on Sunday that the Spanish material produced in court, which had been commissioned by the CIA, specifically includes high-resolution video coverage of Julian and I discussing various matters. Now, it's illegal to spy on a prisoner and his friend, and I was Julian and a friend of his discussing various matters. Julian had a right to privacy. The evidence to the Spanish court also included a CIA plot to kidnap Assange, which went to the U.S. authorities' attitude to lawfulness in his case and the treatment he might expect in the United States. Julian's team explained that the Spanish legal process was happening now, and the evidence from it would be extremely important. But it might not be finished unless the evidence not fully validated and available in time for the current proposed timetable for the Assange extradition hearings. For the prosecution, James Lewis, QC, stated that the government strongly opposed any delay being given for the defense to prepare, and strongly opposed any separate consideration of the question of whether the charge was a political offense excluded by the extradition treaty. And Vanessa Barreza took her cue from Lewis and stated categorically that the date for the extradition hearing, the 25th of February, could not be changed. Okay, by the way, that was a pretty rapid date anyway, unusually so for extradition hearings. But that was set very soon after he was hijacked from the embassy. She was open to changes in dates for submission of evidence and responses before this, and called a 10-minute recess for the prosecution and defense to agree to these steps. What happened next was very instructive. There were 5 representatives of the U.S. government present. At first 3 and then 2 more arrived in the course of the hearing, seated at desks behind the lawyers in court. The prosecution lawyers immediately went into a huddle with the U.S. representatives, then went outside the courtroom with them to decide how to respond on the dates. After the recess, the defense team stated they could not, in their professional opinion, adequately prepare if the hearing date were kept to February. But within Baraitser's instruction to do so, they nevertheless outlined a proposed timetable for delivery of evidence. In responding to this, Lewis Jr. counsel scurried to the back of the court to consult the Americans again, while Lewis actually told the judge he was, quote, taking instructions from those behind, unquote. In other words, the UK prosecutor was taking instructions from his American masters. It is important to note that as he said this, it was not the UK Attorney General's office who were being consulted, but the US Embassy. Lewis received his American instructions and agreed that the defense might have 2 months to prepare their evidence. They had said they needed an absolute minimum of 3. But the February hearing date may not be moved. And so Baraitser gave a ruling. Baraitser gave a ruling which agreed with everything Lewis had said. At this stage, it was unclear why we were sitting through this farce. The U.S. government was dictating its instructions to Lewis, who was relaying instructions to Baraitser, who was ruling them as her legal decision. The charade might as well have been cut, and the U.S. government simply sat on the bench to control the whole process. Nobody could sit there and believe they were in any part of a genuine legal process, or that the magistrate was giving a moment's consideration to the arguments of the defense. Her facial expressions, on the few occasions she looked at the defense, ranged from contempt through boredom to sarcasm. When she looked at Lewis, she was attentive, she was open and warm. The extradition is plainly being rushed through in accordance with a Washington dictated timetable. Apart from a desire to preempt the Spanish court, providing evidence on CIA activity in sabotaging the defense, what makes the February date so important to the USA? I would welcome any thoughts. Okay, so Vanessa Baraitser dismissed the defense's request for a separate prior hearing to consider whether the extradition treaty applied at all, without bothering to give any reason why. Possibly she had not properly memorized what Lewis had been instructing her to agree with. Yet this is Article 4 of the UK/US Extradition Treaty 2007 in full. Political and military offenses. Extradition shall not be granted if the offense for which extradition is requested is a political offense. For purposes of this treaty, the following offenses shall not be considered political offenses: an offense for which both parties have the obligation, pursuant to a multilateral international agreement, to extradite the person sought or to submit the case to their competent authorities for decision as to prosecution. B. A murder or other violent crime against the person of a head of state of one of the parties or of a member of the head of state's family. C. Murder, manslaughter, malicious wounding, or inflicting grievous bodily harm. D. An offense involving kidnapping, abduction, or any form of unlawful detention, including the taking of a hostage. C. Placing or using or threatening the placement or use of an explosive, incendiary, or destructive device or firearm capable of endangering life, of causing grievous bodily harm, or or of causing substantial property damage. F. Possession of an explosive, incendiary, or destructive device capable of endangering life, of causing grievous bodily harm, or of causing substantial property damage. G. An attempt or a conspiracy to commit, participation in the commission of aiding or abetting, counseling or procuring the commission of, or being an accessory before or after the fact to any of the foregoing offenses. Notwithstanding the terms of paragraph 2 of this article, extradition shall not be granted if the competent authority of the requested state determines that the request was politically motivated. In the United States, the executive branch is the competent authority for the purposes of this article. The competent authority of the requested state may refuse extradition for offenses under military law that are not offenses under ordinary criminal law. In the United States, the executive branch is the competent authority for the purposes of this article. So Murray says, on the face of it, what Assange is accused of is the very definition of a political offense. If this is not, then what is? It is not covered by any of the exceptions from the treaty that are listed. There is every reason to consider whether this charge is excluded by the extradition treaty, and to do so before the long and very costly process of considering all the evidence should the treaty apply. But the magistrate simply dismissed the argument out of hand. Just in case anybody left in doubt as to what was happening here, Lewis then stood up and suggested that the defense should not be allowed to waste the court's time with a lot of arguments. All arguments for the substantive hearing should be given in writing in advance, and a, quote, guillotine should be applied, unquote, his exact words, to arguments and witnesses in court, perhaps of 5 hours for the defense. The defense had suggested they would need more than the scheduled 5 days to present their case. Lewis countered that the entire hearing should be over in 2 days. Okay, so Baraitza said this was not procedurally the correct moment to agree to this, but she will consider it once she had received the evidence bundles. Spoiler. Vanessa Baraitza is going to do as Lewis instructs and cut the substantive hearing short. So Baraitza then capped it all by saying the February hearing will be held not at the comparatively open and accessible Westminster Magistrates Court where we were, but at Belmarsh Magistrates Court, the grim, high-security facility used for preliminary legal processing of terrorists attached to the maximum security prison where Assange is being held. There are only 6 seats for the public, and even the largest court at Belmarsh. And the object is plainly to evade public scrutiny and make sure that the magistrate is not exposed in public again to a genuine account of her proceedings like this one you are reading. I will probably be unable to get into the substantive hearing at Belmarsh. Plainly, the authorities were disconcerted by the hundreds of good people who had turned up to support Julian. They hoped that far fewer will get to the much less accessible Belmarsh. I'm fairly certain and recall I had a long career as a diplomat, that the 2 extra American government officials who arrived halfway through proceedings were armed security personnel, brought in because of alarm at the number of protesters around the hearing in which were present senior U.S. officials. The move to Belmarsh may be an American initiative. Assange's defense team objected strenuously to the move to Belmarsh, in particular on the grounds that there are no conference rooms available there to consult their client, and they have very inadequate access to him in the jail. However, Baraitza dismissed their objection offhand and with a very definite smirk. What a railroad job! Finally, Baraitza turned to Julian and ordered him to stand, and asked him if he had understood the proceedings. He replied in the negative, said that he could not think, and gave every appearance of disorientation. Then he seemed to find an inner strength, drew himself up a little, and said, I do not understand how this process is equitable. This superpower had 10 years to prepare for this case, and I can't even access my writings. It is very difficult where I am to do anything. These people have unlimited resources. The effort then seemed to become too much. His voice dropped, and he became increasingly confused and incoherent. He spoke of whistleblowers and publishers being labeled enemies of the people, then spoke about his children's DNA being stolen and of being spied on in his meetings with his psychologist. I'm not suggesting at all that Julian was wrong about these points, but he could not properly frame nor articulate them. He was plainly not himself, very ill, and it was just horribly painful to watch. Um, and the magistrate showed neither sympathy nor the least concern. She tartly observed that if he could not observe what had happened, his lawyers could explain it to him, and she swept out of the court. The whole experience was profoundly upsetting. It was very plain that there was no genuine process of legal consideration happening here. What we had was a naked demonstration of the power of the state and a naked dictation of proceedings by the Americans. Julian was in a box behind bulletproof glass, and I and the 30-odd other members of the public who had squeezed in were in a different box behind more bulletproof glass. I do not know if he could see me or his other friends in the court, or if he was capable of recognizing anybody. He gave no indication that he did. In Belmarsh, he is kept in complete isolation for 23 hours a day. He is permitted 45 minutes exercise. If he has to be moved, they clear the corridors before he walks down them, and they lock all cell doors to ensure he has no contact with any other prisoner outside the short and strictly supervised exercise period. There is no possible justification for this inhuman regime used on major terrorists being imposed on a publisher who is a remand prisoner. I have been cataloging and protesting for years the increasingly authoritarian powers of the UK state. By the way, we've been doing the same with the US state, haven't we? But that, the most gross abuse, could be so open and undisguised is still a shock. Yes, it's similar to what's been happening to Chelsea Manning, isn't it? The campaign of demonization and dehumanization against Julian, based on government and media lie after government and media lie, has led to a situation where he can be slowly killed in public sight and arraigned on a charge of publishing the truth about government wrongdoing while receiving no assistance from, quote, liberal, unquote, society. Unless Julian is released shortly, he will be destroyed. If the state can do this, then who is next? And then there's a little message from Murray himself, who talks about his own situation. Unlike our adversaries, including the Integrity Initiative, the 77th Brigade, uh, 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 the the Atlantic Council, okay, Bellingcat, and hundreds of other warmongering propaganda operations, this blog has no source of state, corporate or institutional finance whatsoever. It runs entirely on voluntary subscriptions from its readers, many of whom do not necessarily agree with every article, but welcome the alternative voice, insider information, and debate. Subscriptions to keep this blog going are gratefully received. And then he has a drop down box. So, this is the bad news that is going on right now with respect to whistleblowers. Also, Chelsea Manning is still in jail on a contempt charge, getting fined every single day. The fines have mounted up to something like $250,000 or something like that by now. The whole thing is all trumped up. Sorry about that. All trumped up. There we go. Snowden, of course, is still in Russia, exiled from friends and family, but fortunately having his wife with him, whom he married there in Russia. So he is relatively fortunate compared to Assange and compared also to Julian Assange. So here we are at some of the good news. As of October 22nd, okay, there's an article in The Intercept, and there's a video on this too, by Ryan Grimm of The Intercept. Bernie Sanders pledges to end the practice of prosecuting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. Boy, would I love to see that. Would I love to see that. So, let's go through this one. It's not long. As president, Bernie Sanders would end the practice of using the controversial Espionage Act to prosecute government whistleblowers, the Vermont senator told The Intercept in an interview on Saturday ahead of a major rally, in New York. By the way, Ocasio-Cortez was sitting by his side, during this interview. The century-old law had largely gone out of fashion until it was deployed heavily by the Obama administration, which prosecuted 8 people accused of leaking to the media under the Espionage Act, more than all previous presidents combined. President Donald Trump is on pace to break Obama's record if he gets a second term. He has prosecuted 8 such whistleblowers, 5 of them using the Espionage Act, according to the Press Freedom Tracker. And there's a link to that. Asked if it is appropriate to prosecute whistleblowers using the Espionage Act, Sanders said, quote, "Of course not," unquote. The Espionage Act, which was passed in 1917 to suppress opposition to World War I, and now considers leakers to effectively be spies, makes a fair trial impossible as the relevant evidence is classified and kept from a defense, and the bar for conviction is low. The law also comes with stiffer criminal penalties and longer sentences than more obvious charges that might be leveled, such as mishandling classified intelligence. During the interview, The Intercept noted that Trump has referred to White House officials who provided information to the whistleblower, who went through legally sanctioned channels and alerted Congress of Trump's Ukraine activities as, quote, spies, unquote. Democrats widely condemned Trump for the comparison, though those same Democrats have not generally objected to the Justice Department's use of the Espionage Act to prosecute whistleblowers who leak to journalists, suggesting that the media is being treated tantamount to a foreign adversary. Yes, being treated as a foreign adversary. Quote, "Whistleblowers have a very important role to play in the political process," unquote, Sanders said in response. And quote, "and I am very supportive of the courage of that whistleblower, whoever he or she may be," unquote. Asked if he would give a second look at the record-setting length of the sentence doled out to NSA contractor Reality Winner, Sanders demurred, saying that he was supportive of whistleblowers but unfamiliar with her case. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who joined Sanders during the interview, agreed, quote, "I don't want to speak out of turn when it comes to Reality Winner, but I just think the prosecution of whistleblowers is frankly against our democracy. We rely on whistleblowers. We rely on journalists in order for us to hold our systems accountable," unquote. Exactly. Winner was sentenced to 63 months for leaking a top-secret NSA document related to Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election to a news organization that was widely reported to be The Intercept. She is currently being silenced in prison. What was that top-secret NSA document? I'm not sure what it was, but I'll bet what The Intercept gleaned out of that document was that people at the NSA do not believe that Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election was decisive in turning the election to Donald Trump. In other words, that document probably said, basically, in other terms, of course, that Russiagate was bullshit. And I'll believe that until I see that document declassified. Because why else would they keep it secret in this way? Why else? Update October 22nd. During the back and forth about winner, a protester reportedly shouted lewd remarks towards Ocasio-Cortez, and the clip has been edited out of the full video. A transcript of the exchange is below. Grim. Last one. President Trump referred to the whistleblower in the White House as spy. A lot of Democrats jumped on him for that, but his administration and the last one have both used the Espionage Act to prosecute leakers. Do you think the Espionage Act should be used? And so on. And Sanders said, of course, that no, it should not be used, and that he was very supportive of the courage, of whistleblowers. So this is mostly what we said before. And so there's the transcript. Pretty much what was said before. So, okay, that, of course, is very good news. That Bernie would put an end to the use of the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers. Yet another reason to vote him in as the President of the United States. That alone would greatly strengthen our democracy by freeing up the whistleblowers again. Okay, and don't forget, when you use the Espionage Act, that also prohibits the whistleblowers from defending themselves by justifying their leaks in court. They're not able to defend themselves to a jury or to a judge by providing a justification. That doesn't count towards a not guilty verdict. You just can't make that kind of defense of oneself. But if the Espionage Act is ended and gotten out of the picture, then the constitutional right of people to defend themselves by any means possible in a criminal proceeding would once again obtain. That's another reason why we have to do it. The Espionage Act is unconstitutional. It does violate the rights that criminal defendants are supposed to have in our system. Anyway, Ed Snowden found out about Bernie's vow to end prosecution of whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. And Jake Johnson wrote this up in Common Dreams today. And what Jake said is, Bernie Sanders vowed, if elected president, to break with both Trump and Obama administration by refusing to use the repressive, century-old Espionage Act. Well, we've been over this, and we were over also the interview with Ryan Grimm, and Sanders saying, of course not, and saying the law, is very clear. And the video, was reproduced in this article for you to see if you'd like to see it. If you haven't already seen it, I've already seen it. Okay, we've been over this material before, so, I'm not going to repeat it. Common Dreams is seeking donations, at this point. It's a very, very worthwhile publication, as you've seen time and again, on this program. But I don't want that to deter you from going to my Patreon page every once in a while, please. Former U.S. Army Private Chelsea Manning, currently behind bars for refusing to testify before a secretive grand jury, was prosecuted by the Obama administration for Espionage Act violations and served 7 years in prison before Obama commuted her sentence at the end of his presidency. Manning released classified information to WikiLeaks, whose founder and publisher, Julian Assange, had been indicted by the Trump administration for espionage. Last year, NSA whistleblower reality winner was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months in prison for violations of the Espionage Act after leaking classified information. So progressives hailed Sanders' pledge to end the use of the Espionage Act against whistleblowers as a potential, quote, sea change, unquote, and urged other 2020 Democratic presidential candidates to follow his lead. Trevor Timm, the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, called Sanders' vow, quote, the most important stance any candidate has taken affecting press freedom so far, unquote. And he said, kudos to Bernie. This is the most important stance any candidate has taken affecting press freedom so far. Hopefully this will force others to follow. That was his tweet. Snowden, who, like Manning and Winner, was charged with Espionage Act violations, tweeted a simple response to Sanders' pledge, quote, whoa, unquote. So I guess that's the last bit, okay, of that news. So what I want to say generally about this is that Snowden can wait, okay, in Russia, and evidently nothing is going to happen to him. He seems to be safe for the time being. So Snowden can wait for a possible presidency, okay, of Bernie Sanders to actually deliver him from his sufferings. But unfortunately, Assange cannot wait. They're trying to extradite him in the early part, okay, of 2020. And they're going to try to finish with him, if they haven't already killed him in the UK jail. Then, once we get a hold of him, we'll try to finish him during the remainder of Trump's term. As the campaign is going on, as it is going on, we will be trying to give Assange the same treatment that we gave to Chelsea Manning. Solitary confinement, God knows what else. In a military jail, prosecuted under the Espionage Act, everything done in entirely illegal ways, not providing him with any constitutional rights. It's going to be a travesty. It is going to be a disaster. Now, one thing that can possibly save Assange, and I sincerely hope that it does, is a new election in the UK and the defeat of Boris Johnson in that election, and hopefully the election of Jeremy Corbyn, which is likely to bring someone into power there who has completely different ideas about what Assange has done, and who very well might free Assange overnight as soon as he becomes the Prime Minister of England. There is a possibility that in the next week or two that a general election will be called, and that within 60 days, that election will be over, perhaps even less than 60 days. I'm not clear on the timelines, but English elections are much shorter, okay, than ours. And if Corbyn can form a minority government without actually having an election, if the other parties all desert Johnson and line up in back of a minority government, then it can be quicker than that. But that probably won't happen. There probably will have to be an election. If Corbyn wins it, then, as I said, he can free Assange overnight, or he can immediately end his sufferings. He can get him out. Okay, Belmarsh, he can put him into a more humane place while proceedings are going on. He can create a much more comfortable situation for him where he won't be isolated, where his friends can visit, where his mother can visit. Uh, he can be, during that period, rehabilitated somewhat so he can have a fair extradition trial in the UK. If Corbyn even goes ahead with one, he may not even want to go ahead with one. He may simply say, this is a political extradition. We're not going to consider it as of this moment. But Julian Assange is free. That can happen, folks. I'm not saying it will. I don't have a good idea as to whether it will. But that can happen. Hopefully, there will be delivery, okay, of Julian Assange. And great news for whistleblowers and for their supporters before very long. We must hope for that. And we must pressure for that and do what we can. But I'm afraid that with the Trump administration, we can likely do very little. So, that, I'm afraid, is the situation. So, I'm going to consider your comments and questions in just a moment. I want to flash up my please share, like, and subscribe screen and ask you again to become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And I'm now, oh, by the way, I'm doing this program on behalf of New Macro Media. And as you know, it is the in depth show. So let me take a look at your comments and questions at this point. So Amber Lee said, she said someone was a corporate tool, but I'm not sure who she was talking about. Kathy Langan joined. Hi, Kathy. Lana Dell said, poor Julian. Yes, indeed. Julian knows exactly what awaits him here in the U.S. He knows it's totally dire. But John Kiriakou has spoken on this issue. Yes, he has. And the secret courts that convict you without even revealing the supposed evidence, they have to convict. Yes, it's really Star Chamber stuff. It's stuff that was supposed to be outlawed by the U.S. Constitution and was outlawed by the U.S. Constitution. The Espionage Act is unconstitutional. It is illegal. It is long past time that we got rid of it. And my daughter Devorah says, yes, 33 pounds. 15 kilograms is 33 pounds. See? Steve Wolfran said they're torturing Julian. Yes, they are. And Greg says, free Assange. I couldn't agree more. And Rob says, it's joined. And Russ says, I've got to call it a night. Interesting read. Thank you, Russ. I hope my comments were interesting too, Russ. And Amber says, good night. And Jim Bird has joined. Hi, Jim. Gigi Schaumburg joined. Hi, Gigi. Free Assange. She looks terrible. Yes. And she says, hi, Joe. And she says, Happy Bernie has the right has the right view on this, the right position on it. And Amberly says, the only caveat I would offer is if Assange does survive and come to the U.S., he has much more support here from high-profile celebrities we could take to the streets. One can hope. That's true, but there's also a problem with that. The American people at large don't care very much for civil liberties. And the press has been blackening Julian's name here for such a very long time. There are high profile celebrities who will support him. There's no question about it. But this is going to drive the Trumpian nutcases absolutely mad. They're going to set up fights. There's going to be violence. It's going to be open fascist action if this is going on here. I wouldn't be surprised if the time limit over in Britain is being set so tightly, not only to protect against a Sanders election, but to create issues here in the spring over Julian and his treatment in order to mobilize the fascists. The struggle for Julian could end up in a mobilization of the fascists for Trump. And Rob says Corbyn would lose in a general election against Boris. Maybe. I mean, maybe he would. But Boris has looked extremely good to some people right now because he's a wizard as a manipulator, but he hasn't been able to win in Parliament. He wants to have an election, okay, at this point. Corbyn is trying not to have, okay, an immediate election until things turn. It's not clear what the EU is going to do, okay, exactly. It's not clear that Boris can control the situation. If Boris is unable to control the situation, if he loses control of it, and if the consequences are dire for Britain, then Corbyn can ride in on a white horse and be swept to victory at that point. We don't know how this is going to turn out, Rob. We don't know. And it's not because we're not in Britain. Looking at it, okay, from afar, you can see the situation is a very fluid one. And in Britain, it's fluid with public opinion also. People can go into election campaigns with very big leads and end up getting swarmed. And remember, Corbyn's victory 2 years ago now, which added lots and lots of Labour seats to Parliament, was a total surprise. Nobody was expecting it at the time. Corbyn is capable, okay, of many surprises. It depends on how he runs. Who knows what would happen if he's ready to run on a total anti-austerity program and he backs it up with MMT, who knows what can happen. And Rob says his strategy on how to go after the Tories was stupid. Boris was smart enough to put Corbyn on the hot seat to represent what he wants for Brexit, and he chooses to be a Remainer. The majority of the country voted to leave the EU. Now they want to play. It wasn't a heavy majority that voted for leaving the EU, and a lot of them were confused. There are good reasons to leave the EU, and you know that I think they ought to leave it from the monetary sovereignty standpoint. Uh, and when you say now they want to play the oops, can I take by that election? Okay, and let's all have a redo. Look, that election was done at a point of time. Now, it was the conservatives who didn't take the mandate that they won for Brexit and just get out. It was they who failed to do that. Now, I think some of the country has swung. I don't think a majority of them are so fast to leave the EU now without an agreement that is not too hard on the UK. I think the difficulties in Parliament and the discussions for months and months and months have, one, made people tired, but also made them aware that things aren't quite as simple as that. And Rob says, that's nonsense. Jeremy won't do anything for Julian Assange. Julian is a third rail nobody wants to touch. I think Jeremy is a little more courageous about third rails, okay, than other politicians. I think he believes in freedom of the press. I think he knows this is an attack, okay, on freedom of the press. And I think he's going to end the persecution of Julian Assange. Now, we'll just have to see what happens, Rob. I don't know what happens, but we'll see who's right about that. You hear about Yang's response when asked who his political ideals are most closely aligned with? I didn't hear that. He said Joe Biden. Yeah, I knew he was a neoliberal technocrat. It was only a matter of time till the mask of this fraud is removed. Everyone can see who he really is. I love how the Yang gang bangers twist themselves in a knot trying to defend him. Yeah, I know. I always felt that way about him, too. I could see that he was a neoliberal technocrat, Silicon Valley type of libertarian. Corbyn lose to Boris? Maybe. I would encourage folks to make connections with real people in the UK. Skip propaganda news. My 40 plus K UK contacts throughout the kingdom, and all for Corbyn, save one in Northern Ireland, which isn't surprising. Point it, get a feel from the masses. Yeah, but 40 plus people are not really the masses. The point is, Labour didn't do very well in the last election. Neither did the Conservatives. The Brexiters did well. The Brexiters did well. But Corbyn was not so successful. And at this point, the polls say, and the polls, of course, could be lying over there the same way they lie over here. But according to the polls, Corbyn's way behind at this point. Labour's way behind. So, any other comments or questions? If not, I'm going to call it a night. and finish my 1 ounce of wine. Rob says, I don't even know what agreement either side wants. It's vague as all hell. And you know me, I am in favor of them leaving from the monetary standpoint. In fact, I prefer the dissolution of the EU so these countries can regain their monetary sovereignty, but once again, especially for the net importing nations. But substantially reduce the austerity policies and help their countries overall. It's true, but I'll tell you what, Rob, they don't have to leave the EU for that. All they have to do is end the EZ treaty. It's the Eurozone that has to end. The EU can continue, and all the countries can be monetarily sovereign. There doesn't need to be a common currency. That's where the mistake was made. The common market situation they had, actually before that, was working well for them. It was working well and could have continued to work well. But the people who wanted an integration run by the elites, the EZ is the Eurozone. It's the Eurozone Treaty signed in 1995, I believe. That, what is it? The Maastricht Treaty. Okay. It's that agreement that constituted a Eurozone that would have a common currency and that also enshrined the Troika, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission as basically the executive branch of the EU, which of course was totally neoliberal and which has been repressing monetary sovereignty and the independence of the various nations since that time. Yes, that's what has to end. The EZ. But the EU does not have to end. If the UK can stay in the EU, but keep their monetary sovereignty, which of course they still have and have always had, okay, and use that particular monetary sovereignty, then that would be fine for them. That would be advantageous for them. And if the other nations then were to get the same arrangement, if they would end the EZ, then things would be much better. And Rob says the common currency is terrible, and any way to retain that would be detrimental. And a fiscal union at one point I thought is attractive, but then no, these countries but need to be monetarily sovereign, right? Which means there can't be a fiscal union. The fiscal policies have to be in the hands of the individual governments, and they have to be running trade policies where the currencies float against each other. That's it. That's the solution they need. It's the MMT solution. Okay, any other final comments? If not, I'm going to say good night. I'll see you tomorrow again at roughly 9 o'clock. I have no definite idea of what I'm going to talk about yet. I have some vague ideas, but something may intervene, and then I may talk about something entirely different. But here we go. I've got all kinds of things to talk about, and I'm sure I'll have an interesting show for you tomorrow night. So have a good night, and I'll see you then. Do I think he's going to be extradited? Yeah, I think he's going to be extradited if Boris Johnson stays in office. If Boris Johnson does not stay in office, then I think the minimum Corbyn will do would be to give him a fair extradition trial. And if he gives him that trial, he's not going to be extradited. Amber Lee says, "Night, Dr. Joe. Much love. I always learn from you." Thank you, Amber Lee. And Dolores Spears says, "Thank you and good night." And thank you all for coming, really. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope that you did too. And I'll see you tomorrow night. And Jimbird says, "Night, sorry late, but phone banking for Bernie." Great, Jim, great. Phone bank well. Have a good time phone banking. Love to see these volunteers for Bernie doing important work. In fact, I'm a volunteer for Bernie too. But here I'm doing my own thing. And guess what? It seems always to be for Bernie, right? One way or another. We're increasingly ending up at Bernie. Okay, good night again. I'll see you tomorrow.